welcome to So What, a podcast that talks to experts about one thing that is profoundly and perhaps unexpectedly significant, that they will argue should matter to everyone. I'm Sean.
And I'm Madhurima. And today we're talking to Alec Nevala-Lee, who is a biographer, a critic, and award finalist science fiction writer. Our kids have known each other since, what, like a few months old? That can't be right. But
it
maybe
feels like it sometimes. Yeah, but I would say kindergarten, maybe a little bit younger.
Yeah. And Alec is appreciative, Alec, for your joining us today to talk about Borges and a specific story. So you want to tell us a little bit about the story that we're talking about today?
My favorite writer, and I think the greatest speculative fiction writer of the 20th century, is Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine short story writer and essayist. He's been a huge influence on me my entire life, and I have a lot to say about him that I very rarely have a chance to discuss. But I wanted to pick one story. It's called Toulon, Ucbar, Orbis Tertius, and this story is probably the essential Borges story. It's a story that is discussed widely. A lot of people admire this particular story. Karl Rove, the Norwegian novelist, has said this is the best short story ever written, and I would agree. But the punchline is that I think a lot of people who read and talk about this story don't quite grasp what I think is its significance, which even I didn't understand until recently. So it opens with the main character, who is not named in the story, but is clearly meant to be Borges himself, hanging out with a friend of his. And his friend says, there's like a funny saying I remember reading once, that mirrors and copulation are abominable because they increase the number of men. And Borges is like, wow, that's a really interesting, like quotation, where is that from? And he said, I read it in an encyclopedia article about this country called Ucbar. And, there's happens to be an encyclopedia nearby. And the volume that should have the entry for Ucbar is not there. All right. And Borges' friend is very surprised. And he says, the copy I have at home has this article. And Borges says, okay, great. A little bit later, his friend calls him up and says, do you want to look at this article? I went home and I found it in my copy of the encyclopedia. And Borges looks at this article, and it is a 4-page article. It looks like a regular encyclopedia article about a country named Ucbar, which, as far as they know, doesn't exist. This is a
right.
non-existent country. And this article, it's not a parody, it's not satirical, it's just very straight, dry. This is a country somewhere, I think, in Central Asia that it describes in this very encyclopedic way. And so they're not quite sure what happened, because they look at other copies of the same encyclopedia, the article is not there. So someone has inserted an article about an imaginary country into this copy of the encyclopedia that Borges' friend bought secondhand somewhere. And that's part one. Part two is that Borges stumbles across a volume of an encyclopedia that is called A First Encyclopedia of Toulon, volume 11. All right. And in the story, the country of Ucbar, which is imaginary, its literature is all about an imaginary world called Toulon. All right. And so what he has here is much bigger than one article. It is 1,001 pages long, and it contains an incredibly detailed slice of the history, geography, science, philosophy of essentially an imaginary planet. And it's clearly the work of more than one person. It's incredibly detailed. I love this line. It says, an unknown planet's entire history, with its architecture and its playing cards, with the dread of its mythologies and the murmur of its languages, with its emperors and its seas, with its minerals and its birds and its fish, with its algebra and its fire, with its theological and metaphysical controversy. So the mystery is like, who did this? Someone has invested a lot of time and effort into making this imaginary encyclopedia, which obviously has to be the work of more than one person, because every subject is written by an expert. And so, right? And so it looks like there's some kind of conspiracy or secret society that for some reason is devoted to producing this encyclopedia.
To just clarify, though, because you said, it's like the science of the region, but one of the things that the story makes clear is that the place Toulon maybe doesn't have a science in the science way, because it's mainly led by ideas, right?
Yes.
By philosophy.
Yes. This is an important point. All right. So a big part of the story is devoted to explaining the culture of Toulon. All right, based on this fragment that Borges has found in this encyclopedia. And basically, this is a culture that is based on idealism and not materialism. So the idea is that in our culture, we think of things in material ways. We think that objects have reality, okay? And the idea of idealism, which is that things only have an existence in the mind, is kind of strange to us, right? A famously controversial subject in philosophy. Like, it is counterintuitive to think that objects only have meaning via the mind. The twist with Tlan is that this is a planet and a culture that takes idealism for granted and not materialism. So ideas are what count. And ideas in various ways in this imaginary country, in this imaginary world, they can affect reality. So you can imagine something and then discover it in an archaeological dig because you thought about it hard enough and you find the object that you and your friends were thinking about. That's one example, which is, kind of fantastic. The idea is that this is about the power of ideas in this culture. This is a culture based on ideas and on the assumption that the real world can be directly shaped by the ideas we have about it. All right.
Yeah.
So the story kind of breaks off briefly after the discovery of this volume of this encyclopedia, the nature of which is still mysterious. And then there's a postscript, and the postscript is dated 1947. And this is important because the story itself was published 1940. So Borges is writing from the future year of 1947. And what he says is that, well, as we all know now, the 40 volumes of the Encyclopedia of Tlan have been discovered in Memphis, Tennessee. And we actually know who made it. It was a society of scholars funded by an American millionaire who proposed to create this encyclopedia of an imaginary planet. And it was going to be secret. He would fund it with his wealth, much of which came from slavery, kind of finance this operation almost as the kind of cosmic prank. And so now that the encyclopedia has been released in its entirety, what happens is that people are really seduced by the idea of this incredibly orderly imaginary world. They like the fact that Tlan is this kind of beautiful work of art that feels logical and self-consistent and rational in a way that the real world does not. And so what happens is that people start to study the history of Tlan as if it's real. It starts to be taught in schools and starts to kind of take over the curriculum. People learn instead of real history and instead of real science, because the fictional history and science of Tlan is more satisfying in a lot of ways than the history of the actual world. And so what Borges says is that reality yields to Tlan. People are looking for ideas like this. He compares it to the craving for symmetry that people had that was expressed in things like Nazism. And this is during World War II. He's writing this. He's saying that the same impulses that led people to embrace Nazism are the same things that lead them to embrace this fictional world of Tlan, because people want order. They want the world to seem rational. And they want to be told that these things have an order to them. So the story ends with Borges conjecturing that in 100 years, there's going to be the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Tlan, 100 volumes written in one of Tlan's languages. And at that point, as he puts it, then English and French and mere Spanish will disappear from the globe. The world will be Tlan. This imaginary country/planet invented by this conspiracy of scholars is so persuasive that it usurps the place of reality, takes over reality until the world becomes essentially a version of this fictional country.
Right.
And that's the end.
When Sean and I were talking, we were talking about the actual details of the making of Ukba and what that world actually looks like and how much time Borges spends in the details of what that would be. Just as a reader, it can be a little obfuscating, hard to access like immediately because there's so much detail, which of course any kind of description of any real world would take. And I was just wondering, you said you read it first when you were a teenager, it sounded like.
Yeah. And again, the story is very dense, and there are parts of which that I think I probably skipped over a little bit, when I first read it. I didn't quite see the relevance. And I think when you're younger, or when I was younger, to me the story was about world building. If you're the kind of person who reads The Lord of the Rings and looks at these fictional maps that Tolkien makes and the appendices, I love that stuff, right? It's really cool to think about the imagination required to construct an imaginary country, let's say. And this is the ultimate example. It kind of appeals to that part of the brain where I find this stuff fascinating, and it's fun to imagine what would happen if you took that world building impulse to the ultimate and just spent all your time inventing a world that was as complete as the real world, at least, on paper.
Yeah, it does seem like that most of the conversation is about the postscript and not about the world building part. I don't see many people talking about the language, for instance. What would the language look like if you didn't believe in things?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and that's a sort of, it's an interesting premise. Like, well, yeah.
Yeah, so it's full of these things. I mean, again, the story is 14 pages long, and it's just crammed with material. I mean, I read it again just when we did this interview, and I'm like, yeah, there's stuff here that I'd forgotten about, and I've read the story dozens of times. You know, I read it all the time, and there's still these like great little ideas and details. So just intellectually, it is a pleasure to read. Let's put it that way. Even if you don't think about what it might mean, there's a smart person's tingly feeling you get when you read Borges. Which, to me, this is kind of like the ultimate example of that. So yeah, this is all kind of preface to say, I love this story for 30 plus years, or, until my early 30s. And then I kind of realized that it was about something else entirely. And that's kind of why I wanted to bring it to people's attention, that there is something going on here that was not obvious to me. And I'm guessing was not obvious to most readers until recently. So my journey with this particular thread began when I realized I'd read somewhere that the Republican operative Karl Rove is a huge Borges fan. Right, he talks about Borges, how much he loves Borges. I'm like, that's weird because this is a guy with whom I have nothing in common, right? And intellectually speaking, I'm like, why would Karl Rove love Borges? And so I actually went back, and in 2012, I wrote a short piece about it for the Daily Beast, where I'm like, okay, so what does this tell us about Karl Rove? And I essentially made the argument that so in the novel, Orbis Tertius is this secret society of scholars and intellectuals who create an imaginary reality that is so convincing that it usurps the place of the real world. All right. And my argument in 2012 was that this is what Karl Rove is trying to do. Right. Karl Rove and his conservative buddies are trying to create this alternative vision of America that doesn't really exist, that people want to believe in. And if they succeed, they can make that our reality. Right. I think that was a good argument in 2012.
And he kind of made it at one point during the Bush years.
Yeah.
Right. He's kind of credited with talking to journalists about being too committed to reality, that they live in the reality-based community.
So, and in 2012, I saw this as an attempt to usurp reality that had failed. Right. So I want to get back to the idea that Borges writes the story in 1940. And then he has a postscript set in 1947 that is meant to bring the story up to date. And when I look back at my original essay about this story, I feel the same way. Because I feel like that 2012 essay needs a postscript that brings it up to date. Because the world has become Tlan. That is what happened. The alternative reality that Karl Rove dreamt about was realized by Trump. And I think that is my realization. I think Tlan Ukbar Orbis Tertius is a story about the rise of fascism, in particular about the rise of Trumpism. I think this is the story out of every story I've ever read, realistic or otherwise, that best describes the reality in which I live, that describes the world that I live in and how it changed in the last 10 plus years. And I think that is frightening. I think if you had told me this 30 years ago when I was first reading this story, I would have had no idea what you were talking about. But I look at this story now and I see so much in it that scares me because I've seen this process happen. I've seen a imaginary vision of the world take over the world I live in. And it is sort of like this story describes. It is the work of a small number of people working deliberately to create this alternative version of the real world that they're able to convince people to embrace because it is more orderly in certain ways and more satisfying to them than the world as it actually is.
Can I say that I know that, Alec, you and I have talked about Edward Said's Orientalism before. I mean, that is what Orbis Tertius is, the project of Orientalism. That, what I thought was kind of interesting in the building of Ukbar was that we think that it could be somewhere in the Middle East because it has some combination of named actual places and named not actual places, but that call to mind a specific region of the world, maybe. And that's what I was thinking about, because, of course, this whole project of Orientalism, by which I mean the actual project of building a consistent narrative of this thing called the East, has to happen with the Orbis Tertius. It has to happen with a conglomerate of scholars across multiple different fields coming together, whether in direct conversation or not, to build this very consistent narrative of what this place must be. And of course, then that narrative is what allows you to go occupy it. Right. That's the narrative that allows you to actually inhabit that space and exert authority.
Yeah, well, I think your connection to Said is great. It had never occurred to me, but I think it's almost exactly right. The idea that you create this imaginary empire of ideas that allows you to take over an actual empire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the process. I think the vision that Karl Rove, and to a much greater extent Donald Trump and his enablers have created, it's a vision of what America is, right? I love this line from the story that says that already the teaching of the harmonious history of Tlan, filled with moving episodes, has wiped out the one which governed in my childhood. So essentially they're saying this is an alternate history that is more satisfying to learn about in school than real history. Right. And again, like, I'm not saying that Trumpism is unique in this sense. I'm not saying that Borges is predicting Trumpism in itself, but this process in which certain kinds of ideas can be used to shape how people see the world around them and what they believe about that world. I've never seen it expressed more beautifully and frighteningly than in this story. Because the more you look around, the more you're like, well, this describes a lot of things. It describes organized religion. You think about the way that people take the Bible as literal truth. It is a mythology that for a lot of people is more real than real history. And it guides their present actions and the beliefs.
But if you say it loud enough and long enough, and enough people believe it, then it doesn't even matter if it's true.
Yeah. And again, I always go back to, why do people want to believe this stuff? And I think it comes down to the idea we do want structure. We do want narratives that make sense. And I think we look for these things in mythology and religion and, including the religions of science and history that tend to be revised to be more orderly than they really are. And I think this is the underlying impulse behind Trumpism. It's a very orderly vision of the world. The world kind of makes sense, in a way that it doesn't make sense if you don't have that kind of belief system to fall back on. And it's seductive. I understand the appeal. I can see why people want to believe in the world of Tlan, that has been created. So the story ends, he describes that a century from now, we're going to discover the second encyclopedia of Tlan. And he says, as I said earlier, then English and French and mere Spanish will disappear from the globe. The world will be Tlan. Then he says, I paid no attention to all this and go on revising in the still days at the Adrague Hotel an uncertain Quevedian translation, which I do not intend to publish, of Brown's Urn Burial. That's the end of the story. So to me, this is my favorite part of the story, because Borges essentially says, this is happening. I'm just going to stick to what I've been doing. I'm going to do this translation. I'm going to work on my stuff and kind of let the world become Tlan around me. He says, I pay no attention to all this. And that, to me, is where I am. I relate to that character. I relate to the Borges of this story more than to almost any fictional character, because I think, for the last 10 years, I've spent my life, metaphorically speaking, revising my translation of the Urn Burial. I am just sitting at home, doing my thing as a writer, working on my little projects, watching this stuff happen around me and just kind of waiting it out. And I think that, to me, that last line is so powerful, because that it expresses my existence in a way that no other story I've ever read ever has.
It's interesting you say that, because I was actually wondering, because I know you've written several biographies, several science fiction novels, even an intellectual history of science fiction. And so there's an element in that process, it seems, of a kind of Tlan-esque world building creation, right? And not only are you building a world, but as a historian, and especially of a historian of people who are important to our kind of cultural and scientific history, that has a power. You have a power to make that world manifest. When people read about the past, then that becomes the reality, right?
Right.
So I guess, I do wonder, you're saying you're out of the conspiracy, but to me, it sounds like you might actually be part of the conspiracy.
I'm a conspiracy of one, right? This is a good point. As a writer, biographer, and nonfiction writer, I'm selective. I'm shaping the narrative in certain ways. I like stories to have structure. And so the books I write, there's a plot, and the plot is someone's life. And in reality, life is messy. There are all these things that don't go anywhere, and there are dead ends and loose ends. But as a biographer, I have to underline the plot, the through line, and so people's lives end up looking a little bit more orderly than they actually were, right? And I'm aware of this. I think this is a necessary sacrifice that one makes in order to engage readers. I think it's very hard to read a book, even a nonfiction book, without a plot. And I think as a biographer, I have to be honest. I'm not inventing stuff, but I am selecting things that fit my picture of what this person's life looked like. So
you're crafting, right?
Yeah. And so on some level, I am also revising the past a little bit, to make it more orderly, to appeal to readers, which is essentially what Borges is talking about here. So, Wow. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm part of the problem. But I will say that Borges, I mean, this is just one story. All these stories are fantastic. And especially if you work with information for a living, if you're a writer or you're trying to just deal with the massive amount of information that is being thrown your way, Borges is my favorite guide, someone who, before the internet, had thought a lot about what do we do with information? How do we maintain our sanity in the face of information? And he has many stories that are about that exact problem. And so if you're concerned at all with that issue, I would recommend him very highly.
And who among us isn't having difficulty managing information? Well, thanks, Alec. Thanks for talking with us about this particular story. We've been talking about Borges and his story, Tlan Uqbar Orbis Tertius. Before we wrap up, we'd like to ask our experts on the show if there was another thing that wasn't at all within your field of expertise, but that you would have loved to talk about anyway. Like if we weren't concerned with expertise, what would you have liked to talk about?
Wow. Okay. Well, I will tell you that when I first received the invitation to go on the show, the first thing that came to mind was not Borges. It was the 2008 to 2010 MTV reality series, The City, which was a spinoff of the 2006, I think, 2010 reality series, The Hills, which are
and wasn't that a spinoff of Laguna
Beach? Yes,
Beach?
Yes, which doesn't interest me at all. Laguna Beach, nothing there of interest.
Are these reality TV shows?
Yes.
Or,
so
okay, all right. Okay.
So The Hills is the to me like the ur text, shall we say, that follows Lauren Conrad, a young woman in LA trying to make a life for herself. But the better show is the spinoff The City, which follows Lauren's friend Whitney Port when she leaves LA to go to New York. And I love New York. I love New York in the 2000s, which is when I was there. And so to me, watching that show is so comforting because it asks nothing of you. You just have to watch it and absorb these images and this music and these people. And yeah, I would nominate The City as one of the greatest TV shows, I mean, to me personally, because there's something about it that just checks off all the boxes. So yes, if Borges is not your thing, I would recommend checking out especially the second half of the first season of The City.
Okay.
It's like the un-Borges, it sounds like.
Well, my interests are wide-ranging. I love everything.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us. Do you want to say anything about your forthcoming book?
So the book that is of most immediate interest, I think, to listeners is my book Astounding, which came out in 2019 and is a history of American science fiction as seen through the writers John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard. Hubbard, by the way, is a good example of someone who invented a world and then had people believe it, take it further in reality. So there's some connections there. So yes, I don't believe I mentioned Borges, but if you want to know more about my thoughts about science fiction, fantasy, kind of where these things fit in and how they affect people's worldviews, I would say that's the place to go.
Well, thanks. We've been talking today about Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Tlan Uqbar Orbis Tertius, and how it has something important to say about our current post-truth and neo-fascist moment. Today we were talking to the biographer and science fiction author Alec Nevala-Lee. His latest book, a biography of the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Luis W. Alvarez, is titled Collisions, a physicist's journey from Hiroshima to the death of the dinosaurs. And unlike the Encyclopedia of Tlan, you can find it at bookstores everywhere. I'm Sean Johnson Andrews. You can find my writing on my Substack, which is breakingculture.substack.com.
And I'm Madhurima. You can find out more about my work at madhurimachakraborty.net. The music for our show was composed for us by Chris Stokes. You've been listening to the podcast, So What?